Welcome to Merrick Masters on Topic. Today we're focusing on issues involving federal sector workers and their unions. Our guest is Ward Morrow, who is with the General Counsel's Office of the American Federation of Government Employees. And I'm going to ask him to comment on the status of various Trump policies in three basic areas. One would be firings of employees, and reductions in force are what often are called in the private sector layoffs. And second, we'll talk about the revocation of union rights, which has really been across the board in the federal sector, affecting a slew of agencies which are declared to have a national security mission, as well as the Transportation Security Agency, where the employees who work as airport security screeners are employed. And the last area where we'll talk about would be the status of initiatives with regard to mandating a return to office in person, essentially eliminating the remote work opportunities that federal workers have in a variety of different instances in the federal government. So thank you for joining me, Ward. I appreciate your being here today.
Sure, absolutely. I also have a night job every once in a while where I'm an adjunct law professor teaching labor law. And I said to my class when we started in January the semester, I said, this is going to be a really interesting semester to be studying labor law, because everything I teach you, by the next week, there may be a lawsuit doing something completely different. And that's
it certainly, there have been a variety of things affecting not only the federal sector, but the private sector as well, as Trump has tried to change certain Biden initiatives with respect to minimum wage. And also he's changed appointments, or tried to change appointments to various agencies that administer labor law. And this has for significant impact, I think, on the ability of those agencies to fulfill their mission, until at least these cases get resolved in court. But
and I have to be a little careful about what I say about the cases we're involved in, so I don't want to overshoot.
Yeah,
but I can tell you this, that within minutes of him being sworn in, we were in court about the whole DOGE situation under the FACA Act. Is it an advisory committee? And if it is, then there's a whole lot of disclosure that has to be done, which hasn't been done. If it's not an advisory committee, then under what appropriation are they spending money in doing these things? So, I mean, minutes into the, swearing in, we were already in court trying to figure out what in the world is going on. And then these places, the DOGE people going around from agency to agency, people saw that. It wasn't clear what they were doing, why they were accessing all kinds of computer files. That was kind of scary. And then, one of the early kind of out of the box things was going after all the probationary employees, which, probationary employees, I mean, it is a lesser status in a way in terms of having all your full labor rights, all your full merit system protection rights. You are in a probationary status, but generally speaking, people who didn't make it through their probationary status, agencies had some reasons, and overwhelmingly people did make it through their probationary status. So the system kind of worked. But to kind of come in and say, well, everybody on probationary status, none of you are up to snuff, and we're getting rid of all of you all at once, that was really devastating, not just to us in the labor movement, but I mean to all of these really bright young people, and they were mostly young people, who were right out of school. Maybe this was their first job, maybe they just gotten their PhD. Everything they've done in life, they've been superstars. They got this great job. And I mean, I've talked to many of these people. This was their dream job to do the public good, to be in the public interest, and then be told, after they've been told by everybody they work with that they were doing a fine job, that they get this letter saying, no, you're doing a horrible job. So it's
well, I think in terms of the administration, everything's on the table, and the old rules don't apply as far as it is concerned, because they believe that, rightly or wrongly, the old rules are faulty. Either they are usurpation of executive power, Are there an overextension of agency power vis-a-vis the White House, or just simply they have been abused by various administrations in the past? And I'm not certain where the truth lies in any of that until the courts sort it all out. But we'll have some major significant decisions, which will, I think, ultimately have a very important effect on the scope of executive versus managerial power and statutory rights within the agencies.
And just sort of basic civil service laws. I mean, a lot of these young people who came in, I mean, they were very aware that elections have consequences. The administration decides what direction we're going and that sort of thing. And these are the folks that just sort of work to carry it out, you know, in the best interest of the agency, committed to the mission, that sort of thing. And now people aren't sure what it is that we want. I mean, it's obviously clear that this administration is very concerned about loyalty, whatever that may mean. What laws will be broken, what policies and procedures will be changed, may be negative, and not have any criticism of that. One of the things that, you know, we in the labor movement have always been concerned about was making sure that people could whistleblow, to make sure that people could, you know, stand up and say, hey, I don't think this is right. Not necessarily because they want to change the political ideology, but simply that maybe a program just isn't working the way it was intended, or people are doing scientific research and they, you know, what they were working on is showing something different than what they intended to find. And those are sort of non-ideological, sort of merit-based type things that this administration doesn't seem to want. And the scariest one recently has been the firing both of the employees, but also leading researchers and administrators at NIH, National Science Foundation. These are people that do cancer research, which I never thought of as a partisan issue, or that you had to be loyal to an administration. You were fighting to cure cancer for everybody, and nobody asked what your political party was, or if you were registered to vote, or anything like that. And then, you know, concurrent with that is the money that's going out to the universities, which is going to be hampering research, you know, that could take decades to get back to, and to try to attract the best and brightest to be doing that scientific research. So, you know, some of the most outspoken people in what we've been encountering have been people from the CDC, people from the EPA, you know, people that are dealing with sort of the environmental and health crises that are out there. And they've been concerned about the science as well as their jobs. So the probationary stuff, when that kind of hit, you know, a number of things happened. I mean, there were obviously lawsuits, but there was also a lot of interesting stuff going on with the Office of Special Counsel. And I was working on some of that. We had a lot of cases that we were starting to bring there, and they were having some success initially, especially with USDA, getting everybody back. And then the special counsel who was doing that gets fired in the middle of all that. And so that's kind of put a real hamper on where things are. I mean, a lot of people did get put back, which was good. But now it seems like it's almost a yo-yo where they got put back, but then there's going to be these RIFs coming through, and they may be riffing some of the same people that just got put back. And for employees, I mean, you know, how frustrating can that possibly be? I'm shocked actually that most of the federal workforce hasn't gone out on workers' comp. I mean, the head of OMB said even before he came in that he wanted to traumatize the workforce. He wanted employees to not want to go to work. And, you know, I think he's been somewhat successful with that. You know, employees feel like they can't do their jobs. They're scared about doing their jobs. They're scared what their status is. Should they leave? Should they stay? You know, are what they're doing correct, or are they going to get down the road disciplined for something? It's very scary right now.
Well, let's get into some of the details about the firings and the RIFs, not in terms of individuals, obviously, but the agencies that have been affected. But first, tell us what your title is at AFGE and what you do in that role. And then let's talk about what the impact of the probationary firings. If you just take a look at what the president did initially before the courts overturned and maybe reinstated employees, but how many people that you represent who are probationary employees were actually fired by the president, and how many people do you anticipate will be RIFed under the various agencies that have submitted plans? Some of them have been leaked already, like I think the Veterans Administration, they indicated that 80,000 employees out of 480,000, something like that, in the agency would be subject to reduction in force. But give us some idea of that. But first, just tell us what you do at AFGE.
Sure. I'm Assistant General Counsel for AFGE. Primarily, I'm Legislative Counsel is the main function, but there's not been a lot of change to federal sector labor law in a number of decades. So in addition to that, I tend to do legal advice to our Political Action Committee, our Legislative Department generally, our Communications Department. And somehow through that, I became the Hatch Act expert. Early in the 2000s, with the oncoming of email, there were a lot of Hatch Act cases. Somehow that became part of my portfolio. And through that, I also became the whistleblower attorney because it's all the Office of Special Counsel. So I have a lot of interaction with the Office of Special Counsel in terms of.
Well, you deal with a lot of very technical and precise rules and regulations that really, I think it requires a voluminous amount of study to comprehend, because they are very exacting, I think, in terms, if you're an outside person coming in and you look at these things and you think, it's hard to figure out what exactly applies, doesn't apply to some of them. So your job is a really critical one as you try and navigate these legal challenges that are ongoing. But tell us a little bit about the firing of probationary employees and the RIFs that are forthcoming. Do you have any idea how many employees have been impacted by that you represent?
Well, we represent over 750,000 folks. All of them potentially, have concerns about what's going on here. But unfortunately, the administration does not consult with us before they do things. As soon as the election was over, I was saying to people, I know we're back to Friday night at 5:30. They're going to release, some crazy regulation or some crazy new policy, and by 6 o'clock, the news media is going to be calling, asking for our reaction to something that happened while we were on the train going home for a 3-day weekend. This seems to happen all the time. So they have not really briefed us on exactly how many people they're going after, or what agencies. We sort of see it as it comes out. And as it comes out, we react to it. And that's why you've seen so many cases, not just with our union, but all of the unions in the federal sector banding together. The AFL-CIO, Democracy Forward has been a wonderful partner in all of this, providing some, legal expertise. Public Citizen, some large law firms are doing a lot of pro bono work. A lot of people are very concerned about all this because it gets to the fundamentals of protecting democracy. You've got to have a vital civil service that is nonpartisan, does the missions of the agencies. And if you do away with that, that's one of the biggest guardrails that are out there. And what all the legal experts were saying even before the inauguration was, one of the big guardrails that's going to be there are going to be these collective bargaining agreements, because they can't just go in and willy-nilly start kicking people out of agencies. They've got to follow the policies and procedures. They've got to follow the contract. And of course, last week, the administration went into court in Waco, Texas, to basically say, hey, we don't like the fact that there's these collective bargaining agreements, and we want to constrain stuff we might want to do. So, please let us out of all of them. I always thought contract law, even from when I was a first-year law student, was basically sacrosanct. If you have a contract, you got a contract. That's what it is. But apparently, that's now been brought up to the courts to take a look at. And alternatively, at the same time, you see the executive order that came out last week saying, well, for national security, we're going to take away basically 70% of the people that we represent, that we've been and have been representing for 40, 50 years, without any national security problems. I mean, there are things that have been taken out over the years, but they've been very small, narrowly defined, narrowly tailored to national security, usually dealing with counterintelligence and things like that. Not just, well, you cut the grass at the DOD or the VA and we think that's national security. So there you go. It creates a lot of problems, even if we are able to put the genie back in the bottle through the court system down the road. Last go round with the Trump administration, when they did some of that, and kicked union people, even though we had contracts, out of their offices, off of official time. And ultimately, we were able to settle a lot of those down the road. But in the interim, it meant you had no union office, you had no union officers, you had people who had been on official time handling grievances, learning all the agency's policies and procedures, spending time talking to members so that what got filed were actually legitimate grievances and not just anybody's gripe about anything that could tie up a lot of time, ultimately saving money for the agency and the taxpayers. With all of those folks gone, a lot of them who were retirement eligible said then and are saying again, I'm going to take the fork in the road, or I'm going to take the Vera, the early out, and retire, because we don't know what's going on, and that's going to be devastating to the infrastructure of all of the unions and really the entire agency. You've got people in agencies at all levels, not just who we represent, who are saying, I can't work in this kind of environment. So that's going to create a problem. But yeah, as you mentioned, the 87,000 at the VA, I'm not sure how many of them are doctors versus how many are social workers versus how many are nurses. But when you're talking about that large a number, you're going to be talking about people who do clinical work as well as administrative work. And the VA has been understaffed for years. They've had lots of vacancies. They've had trouble trying to get people to come to work there, particularly at the higher medical clinical levels, because while the salaries are good, they're not as good as a lot of people get in the private sector. So, if you're going to get rid of people, you're going to push them into more expensive care. If they go into more expensive care, the agency's budgets are going to be what they are, and they're going to start cutting back on services, and that's going to impact veterans in a way that they're not going to get the services that they think they should have and that they should have. And a third of the folks that work there at the VA and really the whole federal government are veterans themselves. So this is having a disproportionate and very heavy impact on America's veterans. And I think that's something all Americans should be considering.
Do you have any idea when you talk to your members? I mean, do they ask you if when these RIF plans are going to be made public? I believe they were due from the agencies into the Office of Personnel Management by March the 13th, something like that. And then there's another deadline as to when they might be formalized. There's probably some discussion between OPM, the White House, and the agencies themselves now about how to implement these and who to include in those numbers. But do you have any idea when we might have a better idea as to the full scope across the federal government of these reduction in force plans will be known?
I think the big one is going to be all of the people that took the fork in the road situation that started early, that each agency seems to be handling it a little bit differently of who's on administrative leave, who's not on administrative leave, who's working from home, what they're doing. But when all of those folks, their resignations become permanent, I guess the end of August, we'll know specifically how many people and where. But that number seems to be a little amorphous. And then on top of that, they've had early outs in a lot of places, sort of almost like a second round. And people are leaving on that. And I don't know that those numbers are still complete, but you're correct that each agency has had to send numbers over. But of course, when the numbers come over, particularly some of the political appointees get into the agency and bring in some of their people, they start to see what they need. And if you're getting rid of it, I've heard since the Reagan administration about cutting the fat, but I feel like at this point, the fat's long been gone. We're now cutting the bone, the muscle. They're cutting contractors. They're not bringing in new contractors to perform functions. So it's not just even the unionized employees that we represent. Everybody related to the federal government is being hit. Grantees, contractors, and
did anybody come? Most of the I've been in universities where we have over the past, I would say, 2 decades, regularly had reductions in force, layoffs, or something similar to that in effect. And usually what happens is that they will tell you that you have to cut your budget by 3%, 5%, 10%. And in order to meet that objective, you may or may not have to lay off people, but you do whatever you need to do in order to meet that objective. Did they give you any idea? Did they give you a number to think about and say, your agency needs to cut 20%, your agency needs to cut 50%, your agency needs to cut 10%? Are your agencies free to make up those own numbers workers on as they go along?
Part of it is they weren't really working with the agencies to begin with. Some of these decisions were being made by the folks in Doge and, seemingly at OPM, but, not career staff at OPM. So the feedback we were getting from management even was, we don't know what's going on. They didn't consult with us. They didn't ask us to prioritize in any way. This stuff is mission critical. This stuff is nice to have, but if we didn't have it, it'd still survive. It was none of that. The fork in the road was literally, we want to get everybody out. We don't care what you do. We don't care how long you've been here. We don't care if you're a top performer. And that memo was really written in a very scary way. There was something they kept referring to as the 4 pillars. And one of the pillars was like suitability. We're gonna now take everybody who doesn't leave and put you through the ringer to see if there's any reason we can force you out and make your life miserable. We're going to relook at performance management measures. And if we think that you're not performing the way we want, then we're going to subjectively decide what that is. Then we'll punish you and fire you and get you out that way. It's really been devastating. And I don't know what the big game plan isn't particularly clear. I mean, Project 2025 is out there, so we know, some of the things, but what's the intention? To run out all the merit system people and then just hire political allies? Is this to get everybody out and set up Schedule F and make everybody, a political appointee? Which, now when you're looking to attract people to the federal government and we're trying to get the best and the brightest, and it looks like, everybody's going to be, in or out depending on which administration. And usually people went into the government because you knew you weren't going to make $1 billion, but you had good benefits, you had a stable employer, stable employment, you did your best, and and you were doing it in the public interest. Now you've got people coming in going, I don't know, am I here for 6 months? Am I here for a year? Am I here for 4 years? Nobody knows. But I think at the end, we're going to see when the fork of the road stuff goes through, when these early retirements go through, probably as we start looking into the next fiscal year, because I don't think at this point they're looking to replace people who are leaving. We'll know just how much damage has been done.
I think they came up with a ratio that they could only replace
1 out of 4.
1 out of every 4. And that's a very small number to be able to replace. You presume that most of the positions that are there to begin with are necessary. And if they're not necessary, then you presume that the agencies will be able to ferret out under the new leadership what those positions are that they might want to get rid of. But it seems to me that this is a very amorphous work in progress to come up with whatever the number might be. But if the tariff announcement yesterday is any indication, I would be inclined to think the number will be larger rather than smaller. And that when they add up all these RIF plans, and I don't think the agencies, as you pointed out, I don't think they were probably allowed, you just go ahead and do whatever you want to do and give us the plan. I think they were probably said, this is what we're really looking to come from this, and certain levels of cuts or reductions in force along those lines, or if they don't like them because they're too small, they'll send them back and say, you got to do more than this. Whatever the case might be, it's going to be a large number, but still, it won't be known until it's announced, just like the tariff situation. And I was going to ask, go ahead.
The other thing, I haven't seen a lawsuit out yet, but I have to think one of the more interesting areas is the Comptroller General and looking at the Impoundment Act and whether that applies, because Congress has appropriated money for these positions. So under what authority are they simply just doing away with all these positions? It's not like there's budget crisis. And I mean, normally when there's a RIF, like you mentioned with universities, maybe, enrollment is down, and because of that, less money's come in. And so now there's a payroll crisis and we have to respond to that. This is not that. This is just the opposite. You've got these positions that are out here that have been funded, and the president's coming in saying, I just don't want to spend the money. I'd be looking, I don't know where they are in this, and I don't have a crystal ball, but I would think the Comptroller General should be filing something at some point soon.
Well, that's an interesting question, and we certainly want to follow that. Let's turn now to union rights. And the administration, I kind of got an inkling that they were going to do something with TSA when there was a report that was appeared in the Washington Examiner a few weeks ago, said that they were questioning whether Pistoli's memorandum of 2011 to grant TSA employees the right to representation by a union, they thought that that might be problematic. And sure enough, wasn't too much longer after that report came out that Secretary Nome issued a memorandum saying that they were revoking that. So that denied the collective bargaining rights to 47,000 employees in the Transportation Security Administration, the airport controllers, our screeners that we know them as on a daily basis when we go to the airports. In addition, the president did something much more sweeping in which he took a provision in the Civil Service Reform Act, as you mentioned, that allows for national security agencies to be exempted from the Federal Service Labor Management Relations statute and the bargaining rights it provides, and said that this doesn't apply. And I did a back of the envelope calculation to the top agencies with the most employees that were affected. And there were a whole slew of independent agencies that were also included. But if you look at the big ones, the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, Defense, the VA, Treasury, et cetera, you come up with over 1 million people. And so I would think that the actual number is substantially larger than that, which means you were essentially taking the bargaining rights of more than 50% of the federal workers who are currently represented by employees away. What is the status of that now? And I read the Nome's order and memo and some of the wording that came out from the Office of Personnel Management and guidance to that effect, that the unions not only lose the right to bargain, they lose their recognition rights. So if I were a manager, I'd be saying, I don't really have to talk to a union representative because they're not even recognized. Is that a fair assessment of where things are intended to be by the memoranda and order of the president?
I think that would certainly be management's perspective on it. I mean, because some of this stuff's in litigation, I got to be careful in how I talk about it. But I can say this, that, we have said for, well over a decade now that TSA needs to be statutorily put in Title V, Chapter 71. The setup of TSA was done so fast. There's this footnote. We've actually litigated over a footnote. And the footnote basically said the head of TSA can do whatever they want, waive whatever they want to set up TSA. Well, TSA has been set up for a while now, so I'm not sure why anybody thinks that's pertinent, because it's over now. But the footnote still exists, which was the reason for the fiscal declaration. And we have signed contracts with the agency. So, the question, I guess, for the courts is, do contracts mean anything? If you sign a contract with an agency, it can change other things at the end of the contract, I suppose, but certainly not during the pendency of the contract, because you've entered into this agreement. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. But it's also a little bit like PATCO on steroids. It's, the numbers of people that were impacted and affected. TSA has had trouble staffing up there as well. Their pay was much lower than the GS schedule. We've had to fight to get that taken care of, and had support by management. I mean, this was not, I mean, the relationship between the union and management, in the past few years, in terms of fighting at Congress to get better pay so we can recruit and retain the best folks, that relationship's actually been relatively good on those issues. This throws gasoline and fire on all of that, which is going to be difficult to keep people employed there. Taking away rights from people is pretty radical.
I was going to say that when I look back at PATCO, a couple interesting points about it vis-a-vis the Reagan's administration relationship with the union. prior to the strike itself was that they were negotiating with the union over items which you couldn't statutorily negotiate over. They were negotiating wages and other things and making efforts from their perspective to meet the demands of the air traffic controllers then. And then when they fired the strikers, and Reagan could make the case that he had the authority to do that because you're not allowed to strike in the federal government. But still, the administration actually went through the regular procedure to decertify the union as a representative of the air traffic controllers. What you have here is they're not making an effort to decertify the unions or in any way say that they have to go through a regular process to do that. What they're saying is, by executive decree, we don't have to recognize you. And that, to me, in and of itself, is the same thing as saying your contract doesn't apply. And I think the language of the executive order certainly insinuates that if it doesn't outright say it. And therefore, I would think from their perspective, they're not going to negotiate with the union, and also they're not going to negotiate with the TSA employees because their case would be stronger there than it probably is with the national security interpretation of what role the agencies play. But what do you tell your employees, your union representatives at these sites? How are they supposed to make their case to management if they have an employee that brings a grievance? Are they supposed to just go ahead and bring it like they normally would and just wait to be rejected? What's the advice that you've given them?
Well, it's twofold. I mean, the first is that, the old union thing of, obey now, grieve later. That's still in existence, but our view is these contracts are still in existence from our perspective. So therefore we want to see them enforced, but we also understand what they're going to do on their level. And there's a lot of different ways to skin the cat. And you can still go to the Merit System Protection Board with certain things. You can still go to the Office of Special Counsel with certain things. You can certainly go to Congress with certain things. And all of those things, whether we have collective bargaining, whether we have a contract, those things still exist for employees, and we can still represent folks in that. If they have an EEO case, we can certainly still represent them in that. So there's still tons of things that a union can do even without collective bargaining to represent folks. And the largest part of that is really going to be the legislative fight to try to change that. And a bill came out, I believe it was yesterday. Brian Fitzpatrick, a Republican from Pennsylvania, is one of the co-sponsors. It's a bipartisan bill to basically move the needle back to before the executive order. That seems to be the gist of it, that would invalidate the executive order and reimpose everything the way it was on March 28th or something like that. Because I'm finding, as I talk to folks, you've got people in agencies who politically are all over the map. They live geographically all over the country. I think the DOJ people came in thinking everybody that works for the federal government works in Washington, D.C. or just right outside. And it fails to recognize that you've got federal prisons that are all over the country. You've got military bases the size of large cities all over the country. 80% of the federal employees don't work in the DC area. And those folks, I mean, you see the protests are going on, not just in DC, they're going on all over the country.
It's much more decentralized than intimated by the administration. Let me ask you if as the order of the president, I think in the guidance memorandum said that the agencies would no longer collect union dues. They would no longer deduct that deductibility of union dues from the payroll would not be, that service would not be provided anymore. Have they done that to your knowledge?
I think it's an agency by agency. Some agencies are able to move fast enough that they can do that and turn on a dime. Some, it's going to take a pay period or two before that hits. And also because we're going to have litigation going on, there might be a temporary restraining order to stop them from doing that. The truly weird part of this is if you buy a used car from a used car company and you want part of your paycheck to go to the used car company or to a bank or a credit union or whatever, you can do that literally with everything. I mean, you can do your United Way contribution, but the one thing you won't be able to do is send money to your union if you want. That seems pretty weird that we would be singled out just for that. But I don't think this is unknown to folks, but we've been trying for a number of years now, somewhat successfully, more so now because it's critical, to move people to electronic dues situation. We call it e-dues, where people can go online, use their credit card, and pay their dues directly that way. And as more and more people are moving in that direction, whether the paychecks stuff hits or not, in some ways you're far better off on e-dues because it seems like they're monitoring who's in the union, who's going to rallies, what's put on social media. People have concerns around that. If you're paying
are the e-dues paid directly to the union rather than through the agency?
Yes. It's it's like paying for anything with a credit card. I mean, if you order Grubhub, it's actually the same company with the same level of security as like Grubhub and some of that.
Well, that's certainly a way of keeping the arrangement that you have now, where they can deduct the dues from however you deduct them from the paycheck or whatever, or the banking account, whatever you do for that purpose. Let me ask you, have they done anything with regard to official time and denying people official time requests at this point?
Agency by agency, I mean, we've been told by some folks that official time is over with. I'm not sure when that takes effect. I mean, they've gotten notice, but you've got to put somebody back somewhere. You've got to train them to redo, some new job somewhere. So I'm not sure how long that's going to take. My suspicion is that probably at the level of the agency, everybody's waiting to see is there going to be a TRO? Is there going to be an injunction? And if there is, then, it's status quo. And if it's not, I think it's going to create real chaos. So, again, agency by agency, we'll see.
Let's turn now to return to office in person. The president campaigned and made a big deal about wanting federal workers to return to in-person work. And they made a big deal out of it right after he entered office. It was one of the first things that he did, in saying that the agencies must develop plans immediately to require people to return to work, or they will, if they don't, they will be summarily dismissed, something to that effect. How far along are they? Have they, in most agencies, required people to come back to work? Are most employees now not working remotely anymore, who were working remotely before Trump took office?
I think for folks that were working on telework, and I'll differentiate that from remote for a minute. People that had telework, it's now been greatly reduced to essentially everybody coming back unless there's a snowstorm, and then you can work from home when there's a snowstorm just to keep you working. You can have a snow day. You can have telework, when it's in the interest of the employer only. And I think that's actually pushing a lot of folks to take the fork in the road, to take the early out. We've shown through years of COVID that people can work very effectively from home. But the other thing is there are lots of jobs that never were working from home. I mean, folks that work in the VA that are doing patient care, they don't work from home. People that work in federal prisons, can't take care of the prisoners from home. TSA has obviously been working at the airports. They've never been working from home. Large swaths of the federal government hasn't had any telework at all. Some places have and have used that very effectively to recruit and retain really high level talent. Some people, though, and this has been the most frustrating for some of these employees, they applied for a job where their PD said it was a remote position. They could work from anywhere. So they bought homes, they made life commitments to live, wherever they wanted to live. And now they're being told, you have to come to the office, you have to move immediately, pull your family up and move someplace on very short notice. And that's been a real problem. Some agencies have been a little bit better about that in terms of slowing that process down, but nobody's saying no. But I mean, what's the date certain that you have to move, or at least start reporting to a regional office? We've seen agencies scrambling to try to lease space in places, maybe lease space in other federal buildings, so people don't have to report back to headquarters, wherever that might be, if there's something that's local, all to try to keep talent. But oddly, when you push everybody back into the office, you know, they're going to be having to lease more space, which is going to cost the government more. You're going to have to be having people double up. You may not have enough space in headquarters for them. So, where are they going to move to?
I was going to say, I've read about stories where people haven't had a place to park. They haven't come back to an office or any workspace where they have access to a phone or the other materials that they need in order to perform their jobs. So it's been kind of a haphazard way of bringing them back. It's all about, we have an order to bring you back and you're going to come back. And it doesn't matter what you do when you get here, because we may or may not be prepared for you. So you'll just have to give us time to sort it out. That I'm reading between the lines here. That seems to me that they're hoping a lot of people really do leave, aren't they?
Clearly, I mean, this has nothing to do with efficiency. You can't give somebody a memo that says you can take a fork in the road and have several months where, hey, go take another job. We don't care. Go on vacation. You don't even have to come in. If you're talking about being good stewards of the taxpayer money, I mean, I'm a union advocate. I want to make sure that our members are paid fair wages, have fair benefits. But we're not asking for people to have 6 months to, take a secondary job and do nothing. That's not government efficiency. That's not in the interest of the public or the taxpayer or the employees, quite frankly. They want to do their job.
I think they're saying basically that we want to, we would like for as many people as possible to quit federal government so we don't have to fire as many. Mm-hmm. And I think what would be more effective from their standpoint, trying to make the case to the American people, would be to say, our goal is to cut the federal workforce by 20%. We want to work and find a way to do that. But we need to do that because we need to balance the budget or whatever the case might be. That might give them a little bit more credibility. But when they do things like they fire probationary employees and they say, we're firing you for performance, and there's no record of bad performance on which they can fire them, and you have a RIF plan has to have some sort of a justification. And in some cases, I'm not certain whether the justification would be anything other than what it would be manufactured. And they are offering the resignation plan and the early retirements and the buyouts, voluntary buyouts for other employees, and administrative leave, which is another way of encouraging people. We'll put you on leave for 6 months. We'll not tell you precisely what will happen to you at the end of that 6 months. But you do the math there. You figure it's probably in your interest to get another job in this 6 months. So there's a lot of that going on now, and it's a very uncertain situation across the board. Which brings me to the last thing I'd like to talk to you a little bit about, which is, you've mentioned some of the things that your union has been doing to represent employees. Tell us a little bit about how you've been trying to protect them in this really multi-pronged assault on the federal workforce, and also how you make your case to the American people that what you're doing makes sense.
You're correct. It's a multi-pronged approach. I mean, obviously, we're in federal court, and we're in federal court with allies, other unions that represent folks in the federal sector, Democracy Forward, other organizations have gotten involved. Folks that are concerned about whistleblowing have gotten involved with Government Accountability Project. So the ACLU. I mean, there's a whole lot going on the legal front, but I'm not convinced that the legal front is sole way to deal with this. We've seen rallies not just in DC but all over the country, and a lot of these have been bottom-up led. I mean, it's one thing for us at the national office to send out something saying, "Hey, everybody, go out and protest somewhere." These have been folks at the local level, not necessarily even local officers, but just activists and people, because you're talking about their jobs at this point. who are taking to the streets, that are carrying signs, that are going to rallies, that are going to town halls. It's interesting that the Republicans are saying, "Oh, these are all Democrats that have been paid to come over there." I've never really been paid to go to a rally or a protest. I'd love to find out where you go to get that money, because if it's enough, maybe I'd start doing that. These are people that live in these areas. These are people that work these jobs. You've got veterans in red states and red areas that work at the VA that are very conservative. Many of them voted for this administration and are just aghast. They're telling them they don't have a job, that performing medical services for veterans is simply not going to happen. You're going to have longer wait times, longer lines. Services are going to be cut back. Those are the folks that are showing up at these town halls. Now in Democratic areas, you're seeing the same thing. You're seeing people that work in those areas showing up saying, no matter what the member of Congress has done, you need to do more, because whatever you're doing so far hasn't worked. I think everybody that I know was watching snippets of Cory Booker, just because finally somebody was standing up and saying, look, this may not be, I may not be able to stop everything, but I'm going to do something. I'm going to use what power I have to make some kind of statement. So people are looking to do that, and we're certainly encouraging people to do that on that level. And then you've also seen at the state and local level in many places some response, and the labor movement as well with our community services program, to say to folks, if you're out of a job, here's maybe some state and local jobs that are available that you might be a good fit for. Here are some resources to help you find a soft landing somewhere else to do something else. And people have recognized in most states and local governments that have federal facilities nearby, if you're losing this large a number of people, it's going to impact your state and local economy. So you better do something to try to figure out, is there a way to match these folks up to openings that exist? So we're fighting all of that. I think the Fitzpatrick bill, because it's a bipartisan bill, which kind of pushes back everything to before the executive order, in addition to litigating, I think there's a legislative strategy that's going on there as well. I think you saw in Wisconsin in the judicial election, voters are starting to stand up, maybe not in the Florida congressional races, but those were very, very red districts. But you're starting to see some movement, people saying, this is not what I voted for. Having this level of radical cuts, no real plan to it. This is not what I voted for.
If you were attending a membership meeting or a meeting of your represented employees and other invited people who wanted to come and hear about the situation and what you're doing, what would you be telling them now? What would your message to them be?
The biggest pitch, and it's not just because we want our retirement to be nice, is get on e-dues. Because we need to fund the litigation fight. We need to fund the legislative fight. If we're going to fight to get collective bargaining back, it's not going to be funded by Santa Claus. The members are going to have to fight for that, and they're going to have to be a part of that. And for us to know how to contact them and to work with them, they're going to have to be dues-paying members and be active in the organization. But I often tell people, even before all this, I joined Planet Fitness years ago, and I still don't have my six-pack abs. Well, when you join the union, you pay your dues. You still got to come in and you've got to use the equipment that's there. You've got to come to the meetings. You've got to come to the rallies. You've got to send emails and letters and phone calls to your members of Congress. You've got to start demanding that you be treated fairly, that you want collective bargaining, and work effectively in these campaigns that we're going to be doing on several different levels. I mean, it's sort of like the old Star Trek playing chess on 3 different levels. There's not one way that this is going to be a win. I don't think. I think it's going to have to be fought on several fronts.
Well, I want to conclude by thanking you for joining this podcast and explaining to us a little bit about some of the issues and where they stand right now with respect to federal workers in the areas of reductions in force, revocations of union rights, and return to office policies. The union certainly has its work cut out for it. I wish you and your colleagues the best in trying to represent federal workers. One thing I would say, just a personal observation, is that federal employees are an easy scapegoat for problems in government. And people will often blame federal employees for the rising public debt and for the budget deficits. But the fact of the matter is that it only costs and this I say only advisedly, it's everything because everything is relative, but the compensation in the federal government, compensation including wages and benefits for the civilian employees, is less than $500 billion a year. If you were to cut that all out, you still would not make a dent in the deficit, and you would not bring the debt down. So as a result of that, there's a lot more to eliminating that. You've really got to eliminate programs and change spending for mandatory programs and contracts and procurement and those kinds of things. You've got to change policy. And also, workers get blamed for problems within the systems themselves that were designed by management or by Congress or some combination of thereof, in which they're forced to use equipment that's out of date. And I think of air traffic controllers being in that situation. In my mind, the question I would ask Congress is why haven't you insisted that the management of the FAA or the Secretary of Transportation make certain that they have the most up-to-date equipment now? Tell us what you need, but get it done. They shouldn't be going through these constant upgrades and lagging behind on a continual basis. And I think that's not only true of the FAA, it's true of many other agencies as well, where they just don't have the wherewithal to perform at the level that they're capable of. But thank you, and I appreciate you joining us, and I hope I can return to you in a couple months and get a check-in as to where you are.
I'd love to. I'm so glad you're doing this. I know you were there and saw the fight years ago with NSPS, where we thought the federal unions were going away or going to be curtailed, and we ended up having higher organizing numbers than ever. And up until they took away the TSA stuff and started this new executive order turning off dues deduction, our membership was actually growing. Managers and people that were never pro-union in the past now see the need for a union in today's economy and today's government. So, thank you for.
Well, the administration, they know one thing: they know where the jugular is, and they're going to find it. They're going to go after it. So, I would imagine you will be in court and appearing before Congress and working on the midterms of 2026. And a very busy person over the next several months.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, sir. I look forward to talking with you. Appreciate it very much. Have a good day.